Picture the Caribbean Sea, 1,715. Pull back from the crystal blue water and trace the coastline from Port Royal, Jamaica, northwest across the open Atlantic toward Nassau in the Bahamas. Now follow the trade routes. Spanish treasure fleets crawling from Havana toward Cadiz. English merchantmen threading the Windward Passage. Dutch cargo haulers slugging through the Straits of Florida loaded with sugar and tobacco. Now zoom in on one ship, a 32-gun frigate flying no colors, cutting southeast through the Yucatan Channel at 9 knots. She's been shadowing a Spanish galleon for 3 days, and the crew knows what's coming. Every man aboard has a role. The helmsman keeps the wind. The bosun manages the rigging. The quartermaster divides the loot. The captain calls the shots. But down in the belly of the ship, below the waterline, crouched in a space so cramped he can barely stand upright, surrounded by enough gunpowder to turn the vessel into splinters, one man holds the entire battle in his hands. He's the gunner, and his job is the most dangerous position on any pirate ship that ever sailed. Not because of the enemy, not because of the sea, what he works with every single day. The raw, volatile, unforgiving substance that separates a successful pirate crew from a shattered wreck drifting at the bottom of the ocean. Gunpowder. This is the story of the men who lived and died by the cannon. The men nobody talks about when they romanticize the Golden Age of Piracy. The men who made piracy actually work. To understand why the gunner mattered so much, you have to understand what a pirate ship actually was. Forget the movies for a second. Forget Jack Sparrow and Captain Hook and the idea of swashbuckling sword fights on the deck. The reality of piracy in the early 1700s was closer to an armed robbery at sea than any kind of romantic adventure. And like any armed robbery, the weapon was everything. A pirate ship's cannons were its primary tool of business. Without functional guns, a pirate vessel was just a boat full of desperate men with cutlasses. They could maybe take an unarmed merchant sloop, but anything with teeth would chew them apart. The cannons gave pirates the ability to threaten, intimidate, disable, and destroy targets that were often larger, better crewed, and better supplied. And the man responsible for every single one of those cannons, from the largest 24-pounder down to the smallest swivel gun, was the gunner. The gunner wasn't just some guy who lit fuses. He was a specialist, a trained technician in an era when most sailors couldn't read and learned their trade by doing it wrong until they stopped doing it wrong. The gunner had to understand metallurgy, ballistics, chemistry, carpentry, and mathematics. He had to know how much powder to load for a given range, how to adjust for wind and wave action, how to time a broadside so that every gun fired within seconds of each other, and how to keep several tons of explosive material from blowing up while the ship rolled and pitched in heavy seas. In the Royal Navy, a gunner held a warrant officer's rank. He wasn't a commissioned officer, but he wasn't a common sailor either. He occupied a strange middle ground, respected for his expertise, but never fully part of the officer class. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document. The Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. On a pirate ship, that hierarchy was flattened, but the gunner's importance wasn't diminished. If anything, it was amplified. Because on a pirate ship, every battle was existential. There was no admiralty to send reinforcements. There was no port where you could resupply without risking arrest. If the gunner failed, the ship died. The workspace of a pirate ship's gunner was the gun deck. On a larger vessel, a frigate or a captured man of war, the gun deck ran nearly the full length of the ship. Cannons sat on wheeled carriages lashed to the hull with thick rope called breeching. The guns pointed outward through square openings called gun ports, which were sealed with hinged covers when not in use to keep water from flooding the lower decks. The conditions down there were miserable. Headroom was minimal. On most ships of the period, the space between the gun deck and the deck above was somewhere around 5 feet. Taller men worked hunched over for their entire watch. The air was thick with the smell of tar, bilge water, sweat, and the sulfurous residue of black powder that never fully washed out of the wood no matter how many times you scrubbed it. And this is where the gunner spent most of his time, not just during battle, but every day. His responsibilities didn't start when the enemy appeared on the horizon. They started the moment the ship left port and didn't end until it returned, if it returned at all. Every morning, the gunner inspected the guns. Every single one. He checked the bore for cracks. He examined the touch hole for erosion. He tested the breeching ropes for fraying. He verified that the carriages rolled smoothly on their wheels and that the tackle used to haul the guns back into firing position after recoil was in good order. A cannon that broke loose from its breeching during heavy seas was one of the most terrifying things that could happen aboard a ship. A loose cannon, and yes, that's where the phrase comes from, was a multi-ton iron projectile rolling freely across the gun deck, crushing anything and anyone in its path, punching through bulkheads, and potentially smashing through the hull itself. The gunner also maintained the ship's powder magazine. This was a small compartment, usually located deep in the hold, as far below the waterline as possible. The reasoning was simple. If the magazine exploded, the water might help contain the blast. Might. In reality, a magazine explosion almost always destroyed the ship completely. The magazine was lined with copper sheeting to prevent sparks from iron tools striking the wood. No open flames were ever permitted inside. The only light came from a lantern placed in a sealed glass compartment called a light room, positioned outside the magazine with a window that allowed the glow to pass through without exposing the powder to flame. The gunner held the only key to the magazine. Nobody entered without his permission. Nobody touched the powder without his supervision. This wasn't a power trip, it was survival. One careless spark, one dropped iron tool, one idiot sneaking a pipe below decks, and the entire ship would cease to exist in a fraction of a second. The gunpowder itself was a constant source of anxiety. Black powder in the 18th century was a mixture of roughly 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. When properly made and stored, it was reasonably stable. The problem was that conditions at sea were never ideal for storing anything, let alone a hygroscopic explosive. Moisture was the gunner's greatest enemy. Damp powder didn't fire. It fizzled, sparked, and produced a weak, unreliable charge that might push a cannonball 50 yards instead of 500. Or worse, it might ignite partially, leaving burning residue in the bore that would detonate the next charge when it was loaded. This was called a premature discharge, and it killed gun crews with horrifying regularity. The gunner combated moisture by constantly rotating his powder stocks. He'd bring barrels up from the magazine on dry days, spread the powder on canvas sheets in the sun, and let it dry before repacking it. He mixed fresh batches when supplies of raw ingredients were available. He tested charges regularly by firing small quantities and observing the burn rate and smoke color. Dark, sluggish smoke meant damp powder. Clean, fast-burning white smoke meant the charge was good. He also had to manage the ship's supply of cartridges. These were pre-measured charges of powder wrapped in cloth or paper bags, sized for each type of gun aboard. A 24-pounder took a different charge than a 12-pounder or a 6-pounder. Loading the wrong cartridge in the wrong gun could result in a misfire, a burst barrel, or a shot that fell embarrassingly short of its target. The gunner and his mates spent hours preparing these cartridges in the filling room, a small space adjacent to the magazine. They worked by the dim light filtering through the lightroom window, handling powder with wooden scoops and copper tools, wearing felt slippers instead of boots to avoid striking sparks on the deck. One wrong move and they were dead. Not injured, not burned, dead. Vaporized, along with everything within 30 feet. When a target was spotted, the entire rhythm of the ship changed, and the gunner became the most important man aboard. The captain decided whether to engage. The helmsman maneuvered for position, but the gunner decided how the engagement would actually be fought. First, he assessed the target. What kind of ship was it? How many guns did it carry? What was the range? Was the enemy running or turning to fight? Based on this assessment, the gunner selected his ammunition. And this is where things get interesting, because pirate gunners had a much wider selection of ammunition than the movies ever show you. Round shot was the standard, a solid iron ball, sized to fit the bore of the cannon. This was your ship killer. At close range, a 24-pound ball could punch clean through the oak hull of a merchant vessel, sending a shower of wooden splinters into the crew on the other side. Those splinters were often more deadly than the ball itself. Oak shattered into jagged shards that acted like shrapnel, tearing through flesh and embedding in bone. But pirates usually didn't want to sink their targets. A ship at the bottom of the ocean was worth nothing. They wanted to capture it intact, with its cargo undamaged. So the gunner had other options. Chain shot was 2 cannonballs connected by a length of iron chain. When fired, the balls separated and the chain spun through the air like a horizontal buzzsaw. It was designed to shred rigging and sails, disabling the target's ability to maneuver or flee. A well-placed chain shot volley could reduce a fully rigged merchant vessel to a wallowing, helpless hulk in minutes. Grape shot was a cluster of smaller iron balls, usually 9, bound together in a canvas bag or held in a wooden frame. When fired, the bag disintegrated and the balls spread in a cone pattern, turning the cannon into a giant shotgun. This was an anti-personnel weapon designed to clear an enemy's deck before boarding. It was devastating at close range, absolutely brutal to anyone caught in the open. Canister shot was even nastier. A thin metal canister packed with musket balls, nails, and scrap iron. At 20 yards, it could kill or wound every man standing on a section of deck 40 feet wide. Langrage was the desperate man's ammunition. Whatever scrap metal you could find, bent nails, broken glass, chain links, door hinges, old bolts, all of it stuffed into the barrel on top of a powder charge and blasted toward the enemy. It wasn't accurate, it wasn't elegant, but at close range, it tore rigging and flesh with equal enthusiasm. The gunner chose the load based on the tactical situation. Approaching a rich merchantman that you wanted to capture. Chain shot to the rigging, then grape shot to clear the deck, then board. Facing a warship that outgunned you, round shot to the hull, trying to damage the rudder or punch below the waterline. Defending against a boarding attempt? Canister at point-blank range into the mass of men trying to climb over the rail. The actual process of loading and firing a cannon was a coordinated sequence that a trained gun crew could execute in under 2 minutes. An elite crew, and some pirate crews were genuinely elite, could manage a shot every 90 seconds under combat conditions. Here's how it worked, step by step. First, the gun captain who reported to the gunner gave the order to load. The sponger, a crew member with a long-handled brush soaked in water, swabbed out the bore. This served 2 purposes. It cleaned out residue from the previous shot, and it extinguished any burning embers that might prematurely ignite the next charge. Then the loader shoved the cartridge into the bore, followed by a felt wad, then the projectile, then another wad to keep the ball from rolling back out if the ship heeled. The rammer, using a long wooden pole, pushed everything firmly to the back of the bore. The gun captain then pricked the cartridge through the touch hole, using a sharp iron wire called a priming iron. This punctured the cloth bag so that the priming charge could reach the main charge. He poured fine-grained priming powder into the touch hole and placed a length of slow match, which was a cotton rope soaked in saltpeter that burned at a steady, predictable rate, into the linstock, a forked holder that kept the burning match away from the powder until the moment of firing. The crew then heaved the gun forward, using the tackle until the barrel protruded through the gun port. The gun captain aimed by adjusting the elevation using a wooden wedge called a quoin that sat under the breech. There were no precision sights. Aiming was done by eye, by experience, and by instinct. When the gun captain judged the moment right, usually waiting for the roll of the ship to bring the barrel on target, he touched the slow match to the priming powder. There was a brief sizzle, then a thunderous explosion. The cannon leaped backward on its carriage, restrained by the breaching ropes, and the ball flew across the water. Then the whole process started over. Multiply that by 10, 15, 20 guns, all firing in sequence or in a coordinated broadside, and you begin to understand the organized chaos of a gun deck during battle. The noise was beyond anything you can imagine sitting here today. Not just loud, physically painful. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Gunners routinely suffered permanent hearing loss after a single major engagement. The concussive force of repeated cannon fire in an enclosed space could rupture eardrums, cause nosebleeds, and leave men disoriented for hours after the fighting stopped. The smoke was equally debilitating. After the first broadside, the gun deck filled with a thick, choking fog of gray-white smoke that stung the eyes and burned the throat. Gun crews worked blind, loading and firing by muscle memory because they could not see what they were doing. Whatever air came through the open gun ports was immediately displaced by the next blast. And through all of this, the gunner moved. He walked the gun deck during battle, supervising each crew, correcting aim, redistributing ammunition, replacing injured men, and making real-time tactical decisions about what to load and where to shoot. He was exposed to everything. The blast, the smoke, the splinters from enemy fire coming through the hull, the possibility of a burst barrel or a premature detonation. The injury rates for gun crews were staggering. The most common injuries weren't from enemy action at all. They were self-inflicted, the natural consequence of working with heavy iron machinery and explosive chemicals in a confined, unstable space. Burns were constant, handling hot guns with bare hands. Stray sparks from the touch hole, flash burns from premature ignitions. Many gunners carried scars across their hands and forearms that never fully healed because there was no time to let them heal. You fought the next battle with burned hands, or you didn't fight at all. Crush injuries were the second most common. A cannon on its carriage weighed between 1 and 3 tons depending on its size. During recoil, the gun slammed backward with enormous force. If a crew member's foot was in the wrong place, it was gone. If a breaching rope snapped and the gun rolled free, anyone behind it was crushed against the opposite bulkhead. There are accounts from the period of men being pinned between a loose cannon and the ship's frame, with their crewmates unable to free them until the gun could be secured. Hearing damage was universal and permanent. After a career of working the guns, most gunners were partially or completely deaf. There was no hearing protection. Cotton stuffed in the ears was sometimes used, but it did almost nothing against the concussive force of a 24-pounder firing 3 feet from your head. Eye injuries from flying splinters were common enough that experienced gunners learned to turn their faces away at the moment of firing. Blindness in one eye was an occupational hazard that barely warranted comment among career gunners. And then there were the catastrophic failures. A burst barrel sent iron fragments scything through the gun deck like shrapnel from a bomb. Everyone within 10 feet was killed or severely wounded. The causes were varied: faulty casting, metal fatigue, an overloaded charge, or a barrel weakened by previous damage. The worst fear was the magazine explosion. If fire reached the main powder stores, the entire ship disintegrated. Not sank, disintegrated. Ships were reduced to floating debris fields in an instant. The few accounts from men who witnessed magazine explosions from nearby ships describe a sound like nothing else they'd ever heard, a flash of orange light, and then simply an empty space on the water where a ship had been. Given all of this, you might wonder why anyone would volunteer for the job. And the answer tells you a lot about the reality of life in the early 18th century. The gunner was paid more than almost any other crew member. On a pirate ship operating under the Articles of Agreement, the standard contract that most pirate crews adopted, the gunner typically received 1.5 to 2 shares of any prize taken, compared to 1 share for a common sailor. On some ships, the gunner's share was equal to the quartermaster's, making him one of the 3 or 4 highest-paid men aboard. He also enjoyed privileges that common sailors didn't. His own sleeping quarters near the magazine, better food, because the captain needed him healthy and alert. Exemption from the endless routine of scrubbing, tarring, and sail repair, because his time was considered more valuable spent maintaining the guns. But the most significant reward was respect. A good gunner was valued by his crew in a way that went beyond technical skills. In an era when most pirates were former merchant sailors or naval deserters, the gunner represented competence. He was the man who kept them alive when everything went wrong. The difference between taking a rich prize and drifting helplessly while a Royal Navy frigate closed in to hang them all. The training pipeline for a gunner was long and unforgiving. Most pirate gunners learned their trade in legitimate navies before going on the account. The Royal Navy, the French Navy, and the Spanish Armada all trained gunners through a system of apprenticeship that began in adolescence. A boy might start as a powder monkey at 12 or 13. His job was to run cartridges from the magazine to the gun crews during battle. He sprinted through the gun deck carrying bags of explosive powder while cannonballs punched through the hull around him. The mortality rate among powder monkeys was appalling. Small targets, yes, but constantly moving through the most dangerous space on the ship. If a powder monkey survived long enough, he might be promoted to a gun crew as a loader or sponger. Here, he learned the mechanics of the guns from the inside out. He learned how to read the condition of a barrel by running his hand along the bore. He learned how to judge a powder charge by weight and by feel. He learned the timing of a broadside by watching the roll of the ship and listening for the gun captain's commands. After years on a gun crew, a promising man might be selected as a gunner's mate. This was the first real step toward becoming a full gunner. The mate assisted in all duties, learned powder management, studied the mathematics of ballistics as far as the crude science of the era allowed, and began developing the instinct that separated competence from greatness. The full progression from powder monkey to warranted gunner could take 10 to 15 years. Many men died or were crippled before reaching it. Those who survived and completed the training were among the most experienced and skilled men in any navy, which made them enormously valuable when they decided to turn pirate. And many did. The pay in the Royal Navy was terrible, often months or years in arrears. The food was worse. The discipline was brutal. A skilled gunner who jumped ship and joined a pirate crew could expect better pay, better food, more freedom, and a genuine voice in how the ship was run, since most pirate vessels operated as rough democracies where major decisions were put to a vote. Some of the most famous pirates in history owed their success directly to their gunners, even though those gunners' names are largely lost to history. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, operated the Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slave ship that he captured and refitted with 40 guns. That's an extraordinary amount of firepower for a pirate vessel, more than most Royal Navy frigates carried. Managing that arsenal required a gunner of exceptional skill, and Blackbeard clearly had one. His ability to intimidate merchant vessels into surrender without firing a shot was legendary. But that intimidation only worked because everyone knew that if negotiations failed, those 40 guns were maintained, loaded, and ready. Bartholomew Roberts, arguably the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, captured over 400 ships. His flagship, the Royal Fortune, carried 42 guns and was operated with naval precision. Roberts' gun crews drilled regularly, a practice unusual among pirates who tended to rely on aggression and surprise. His gunner, whoever he was, kept that ship combat-ready during a campaign that spanned the Atlantic from the Caribbean to West Africa. Henry Every pulled off the richest pirate raid in history when he captured the Mughal ship Ganges Sawai in 1695. The Mughal vessel carried 80 guns and 400 men. Every had 46 guns and about 150. The battle lasted hours, and every won in part because a cannon aboard the Ganges Sawai exploded during the fight, killing its own gun crew and sowing panic. Whether Every's gunner deliberately caused that failure or whether it was luck, the result was the same. Superior gunnery made Every the richest pirate alive. Charles Vane proved the flip side. His crews reportedly had poor gunnery, and it showed. Vane was voted out of his captaincy after refusing to engage a French warship, likely because he knew his gun crews couldn't match the French firepower. His replacement, Calico Jack Rackham, inherited those same mediocre gunners and compensated with speed and surprise rather than stand-up fights. The lesson was clear across the pirate world. A good gunner didn't just win battles, he prevented them. The mere reputation of having a skilled gunner aboard made merchant captains more willing to surrender without a fight, which was always the preferred outcome. Fighting damaged your ship, killed your crew, and risked the cargo you were trying to steal. The ideal engagement ended with the target striking its colors at the sight of your guns running out. And that only happened if those guns were well maintained and manned by someone who knew how to use them. The psychological dimension of the gunner's role is often overlooked. Consider what it actually meant to work in that environment day after day. You lived next to enough explosive material to obliterate you at any moment. You knew with absolute certainty that any mistake you made could kill not just yourself but every man aboard. You worked in darkness, in confined spaces, with materials that would ignite if you dropped a tool or scuffed your shoe on the deck. You went into battle in a space that filled with smoke so thick you couldn't see your own hands, while iron balls punched through the walls around you and oak splinters the size of daggers flew through the air. And you did this voluntarily. Repeatedly. For years. The historical record suggests that gunners developed a particular kind of personality. They were methodical, careful men in a profession populated largely by impulsive risk-takers. They had to be. Impulsive men didn't survive long around gunpowder. The good ones developed an almost meditative focus, an ability to work calmly and precisely while chaos erupted around them. Contemporary accounts describe gunners who could load and fire their weapons with mechanical efficiency while the rest of the crew screamed and scrambled. Men who seemed almost detached from the violence they were orchestrating. This calm wasn't fearlessness. It was trained discipline. The gunner knew better than exactly how much danger he was in. He knew what a burst barrel looked like. He knew what happened when fire reached the magazine. He'd probably seen men die from exactly the kinds of accidents he was trying to prevent. His calmness came from the understanding that panic would kill him faster than anything the enemy could throw at him. By the mid-1720s, the Golden Age of Piracy was grinding to a halt. The Royal Navy's aggressive anti-piracy campaigns, the expansion of colonial governance in the Caribbean, and the simple attrition of time and battle took their toll. Pirates were hunted, captured, and hanged in increasing numbers. But the skills of the pirate gunner didn't disappear. Many captured gunners were offered amnesty in exchange for naval service. A trained gunner was too valuable to hang if he could be put to use. Some accepted, others refused and went to the gallows. The irony is that the same navies that hanged pirates also made them. The gunner who served aboard a pirate vessel had almost always learned his trade aboard a man of war. The skills were identical. The difference was the flag overhead and who signed the paycheck. As naval technology evolved through the 18th century, the role of the gunner evolved with it. Flintlock mechanisms replaced slow match. Copper-lined bores resisted corrosion. Carronades gave smaller ships devastating close-range firepower. Each innovation changed the details, but the fundamental reality never changed. Someone had to work with the guns. Someone had to manage the powder. Someone had to stand in the most dangerous place on the ship and make split-second decisions that meant the difference between victory and annihilation. When we think about pirates today, we think about captains, Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, Bartholomew Roberts. We think about the treasure, the gold, the silver, the jewels. We think about the romance, the freedom of the open sea, the rebellion against authority. We almost never think about the man crouched in the dark below the waterline, measuring powder into cloth bags by the light of a candle burning behind glass, knowing that the stuff he's handling could erase him from existence before his brain even registered the flash. The gunner didn't get the glory. He didn't get the legend. He didn't get the Hollywood treatment or the theme park ride. He got the worst working conditions on the ship, the highest risk of death or permanent injury, and the weight of knowing that every man aboard depended on him doing his job perfectly, every single time, without exception. And in return, he got an extra half share of the plunder and a small cabin near the thing most likely to kill him. That was the deal. And for 3 decades during the Golden Age of Piracy, men took it. They stepped into the darkness, lit their slow matches, and waited for the order to fire. The gunner, the most dangerous job on a pirate ship, and the one that made everything else possible.